Look, I've got to address the Indigenous voice issue again and some of the divisive arguments that are being put about the place. But first, the positive argument, why it's being proposed. There's a broad consensus across our national politics, from the conservative right to the radical left, that we should recognise Indigenous Australians, the original inhabitants of this land, in our Constitution. A succession of Prime Ministers from John Howard onwards have endorsed that proposition. And the question is this then, should that recognition just be symbolic, just a naff little mention? That'd be patronising, wouldn't it? But if you put in some flowery declaration about Indigenous heritage, then there's a grave risk of judicial activism, of putting words into the Constitution that could be misinterpreted and end up being divisive. So a lot of deep thinkers, Indigenous leaders and constitutional conservatives decided any poetic and grand statement about our nation, how it rests on the three pillars, as Noel Pearson has described them, Indigenous heritage, British institutions and multicultural character. All that should be said outside of the Constitution in a separate declaration that's got no legal imprimatur. And the constitutional change would be to ensure Indigenous Australians have a say in their own welfare. Remember, race has been in our Constitution since the start, since 1901. And the celebrated 1967 referendum and constitutional change gave the federal government the power over Indigenous affairs. And then decades later, the Mabo decision found that Indigenous Australians actually have rights to this land that haven't been extinguished. So don't pretend that by giving Indigenous Australians a voice, you're dividing the country. Don't pretend that this is divisive. As the former High Court Judge Murray Gleeson said, that division was created in 1788 and it was entrenched in many ways subsequently. The voice is a simple proposition. The federal government has the special power to make laws over one particular group of Australians, the descendants of the original inhabitants, who happen to be the most disadvantaged group in our country. So the federal government should take advice from those people. Advice it doesn't even have to accept. If the government can make laws over one group of people, then surely it's only a fair go to say it must take advice from them. That's not dividing the country, that's introducing a fair go to try to help repair division, close the gap. The reason this should be mandated in the Constitution in a minimalist way, so that Parliament can shape and change the way the voice works as it sees fit, but you have it mentioned in the Constitution as an act of faith to guarantee that the fair go won't be just taken away, and to make sure that Indigenous Australians are indeed recognised in our Constitution. So it's not divisive, it's a uniting and practical reform. The idea that this is not needed because there are already Indigenous people in Parliament is so insulting to those politicians. They weren't elected to represent their race or their people. They're there to represent their electorates or their states if they're in the Senate. We've got Greek Australians, Italian Australians, Irish Australians in Parliament, as well as all sorts of other ethnic backgrounds. Does that mean we need to scrap the Multicultural Advisory Council or close down SBS? Really, there's so much overreach going on in this debate. Are we really so proud of how we've treated Indigenous Australians that we think if we keep doing the same thing, it'll close the gap in education, in health, in life expectancy, in jobs and prosperity? Are we really so insular, so caught up in our own insecurities, that we think when a federal government proposes a law or a policy specifically focused on Indigenous Australians, we don't want that government to take advice from those same people? The funny thing is that Labor and coalition governments have for a long while taken advice from Indigenous advisory committees. Only they've chosen who's on those committees. How condescending is that? The voice gives Aboriginal regions and communities the right to choose their own representatives to make sure their problems and ideas are heard by the federal government. This is proper representation for people who have unique problems, have inherited unique legal rights, and are uniquely at the mercy of federal intervention. It's not a threat to anyone. Conservatives who are railing against what a voice might be in their worst dreams really ought to get involved in the discussions and talk to the people who've done the work and then have some input to make sure none of those fears are realised. Because at stake here is an opportunity to take a big step forward in reconciliation and, importantly, a chance to make sure Indigenous ideas and grassroots experience can help tackle problems like educational dysfunction, substance abuse, domestic violence, youth suicide, and bleak outcomes all round. You don't improve the nation, you don't unite the nation in good purpose by being a naysayer or frightening people in a way that can only increase divisions. Think about what people agree on. Right across the board, people agree Indigenous Australians should be recognised in the Constitution. Right across the board, people agree the federal government should take advice from a representative Indigenous body. So the only sticking point is the exact shape of that voice and whether or not it should be mandated in the Constitution. These are not hurdles beyond this nation's capacity.